He was a photographer, a writer, a producer, and a director. But above all, he was an artist.
I think Kubrick's a visual genius.
He could compartmentalize his mind in 100 places and be able to sum it up, you know, with free hovering attention, boom, boom, whatever he needed to recall from his preconscious.
Stanley was born in the Bronx. He was born of a family of a doctor, a second-generation immigrant from Poland.
Dr. Jacques Kubrick gave his son a camera, which became inseparable from the fledgling photographer. He was soon capturing indelible images of life around him.
On his way to school one morning, he went past a newsstand, and the newsstand announced President Roosevelt was dead. Stanley thought, gosh, what a great picture. He took the picture and didn't go to school, went home, developed the picture, and took it straight to Look magazine.
The editor not only bought the photograph, but went on to hire Stanley as Look magazine's first and only apprentice photographer. Kubrick shone as a photojournalist, and after a few years, he set his sights on making movies.
The short films that Stanley Kubrick made were really an extension of his photojournalism. They are the films of a man whose visual style was formed very early on through still photography.
Kubrick now felt ready to tackle a true feature film. He got a cast and crew out to California, where he produced and directed a war drama titled Fear and Desire.
Even then, Kubrick understood what you needed to make a successful movie, and he inserted a fairly sexy scene with an actress named Virginia Leith, who is tied up to a tree and then menaced by one of the men, played, in fact, by Paul Mazursky, who now, of course, much better known as a film director. So when he came back, he had the ingredients of a very successful commercial film.
I first met Stanley Kubrick back in the very early 50s. When I was at the Signal Corps making Army training films.
We were being trained to be combat cameramen. We would take home the cameras from the Army or rent them and do some experimental work. And on one of the weekends where we were shooting a short subject, actually at my family's apartment, Stanley came to visit. To us, he was already a professional. He was already a proven filmmaker, having done 2 short subjects in Fear and Desire.
Fear and Desire inspired Kubrick to tackle a more ambitious project, Killer's Kiss, which dealt with a boxer on the eve of a big fight. He drew on familiar New York City neighborhoods and friends.
I thought he had done a terrific job, bearing in mind that he did everything himself. He was the cameraman, he was the director, he was the editor. He shot it all silent and then dubbed in all of the voices afterwards. I mean, an incredible technical job. And actually sold the picture to United Artists for $75,000. And I asked him what his plans were for the future, and he said he has no plans, he doesn't know what to do. United Artists said if someday he has another project or something, they might be interested. So I said, you know, I've always been interested in producing films.
He was a producer looking for a project, and he was a director looking for a producer.
So right then and there we said, we'll call it Harris Kubrick Pictures Corporation, and we're in business. And so that night I went to a bookstore called Scribner's on Fifth Avenue in New York and wandered into the Mystery and Western section and came across a book called Clean Break. From the flyleaf, it described it as a story of the robbery of a racetrack. So I bought the book and took it home and read it, and I got quite excited about it. I love the structure of the book that dealt in these flashbacks. I gave it to Stanley the next day, and he read it immediately, and he thought the same as I did about it.
As it turned out, it had already been optioned by Frank Sinatra. But fortunately, Frank Sinatra let the option lapse, and Jimmy, no fool, then or now, grabbed it, got the rights, then worked with Kubrick on putting together a screenplay. The Killing was not a very successful movie in commercial terms, but it drew attention to Kubrick. A lot of people saw it, and a lot of people who were very advantageous to him. People like Kirk Douglas, Marlon Brando, saw the film at private screenings, and they kind of noted him down as a comer.
Kubrick soon found himself directing a major star in the 1957 movie Paths of Glory.
Paths of Glory was Stanley Kubrick's first international film. A characteristic camera movement of Kubrick's was to keep the camera continually tracking along so that it gave a great sense of depth and urgency to the shot, to the sequence that he was filming. Again and again in this director's work, you find that wonderful sense of a camera that is a dynamic camera.
It was an anti-war film, which put it in the category of an art film. And Kirk was really marvelous in being the champion of that picture. We can really thank Kirk for having the wherewithal and the desire to get this picture made.
Fate and Kirk Douglas would again intervene. Spartacus had stalled when its star and the director Anthony Mann had clashed over style. From a motel near their Death Valley location, Douglas phoned Kubrick on a Friday night to offer him the director's chair, if he could start on the Monday morning.
So Monday morning, he's brought on the set and introduced to Laurence Olivier and all these other people. Right, this is this guy that's going to take over this movie. But for Douglas, of course, Douglas thought this was a guy he could manipulate. Kubrick immediately began imposing his stamp on the film, and Douglas loathed it. Kubrick just ignored it, to the extent that, as is famously recorded, Kirk Douglas said, "Stanley Kubrick is a talented shit."
The effect of Spartacus was that Stanley was determined that he would never again work for anyone except himself.
During the production of Spartacus, Kubrick and Harris purchased the rights to Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita.
We read it together and both agreed that we must do this. We couldn't get conventional financing because no major studio or distributor would take a chance, and you couldn't get any guarantees from the MPAA. So it became a question of me finding a way to get it made independently.
On his way to seek financing in Europe, Harris stopped in New York to visit an old friend, Elliot Hyman.
I told him about Lolita, and he said, "How much do you need?" I didn't really know, but I said, "I think Stanley and I need $1 million." And he said, "You got it."
Harris set up production in England. Kubrick wanted a climate more tolerant than America's, and even more importantly, an intellectual atmosphere less obsessed with deal-making than Hollywood.
I went to see Paths of Glory in the local cinema, and I was absolutely devastated. I thought it was one of the great films, and my palms were sweating. I thought I would, and I knew that Kubrick was coming to England to do Lolita. So I wrote him a note and asked if I could work with him, and he interviewed me.
I came to meet him, and the first thing I asked him was how he saw the film was to look. And he said to me, it's a very risque story, this, and I'd like it to have a gloss, like the MGM pictures. And I did some research, and I found out that Culver City, where MGM are, use special filters for their black and white films, and I got hold of a set of these filters.
Lolita was an amazing film for its time. Mason gives a beautifully balanced performance, and of course Stanley managed other actors in the film, like Shelley Winters, to get them to give one of their best performances in a completely different key from those that they'd given in other American movies. But his great find was Peter Sellers, and Stanley realized he was working in Peter Sellers with a comic genius, a man who could not only speak the words as written in the script, but could speak better words that he improvised whenever he got inside the skin of the character, through several roles inside one film. Stanley used to tell me that Peter Sellers was one of the greatest experiences of his directing life. He found a man who was on his own wavelength.
The cast completed Lolita, and it became a critical success. Kubrick's reputation was now firmly established, and he set his sights on subject matter that would become a familiar theme throughout his career: war.
For more than a year, ominous rumors had been privately circulating among high-level Western leaders that the Soviet Union had been at work on what was darkly hinted to be the ultimate weapon, a doomsday device.
In many of his films, he favored the idea of a narrator who would either introduce the film or else who would comment on the action. Stanley believed that that was a good shortcut to telling the audience things that would take much longer to show them visually.
As with Lolita, Kubrick's mind's eye began to shape an inspired story.
He found in a book called Red Alert by Peter George what Stanley considered to be a very strong dramatic story.
Kubrick began to adapt the book to a dramatic screenplay, but every time Harris came to New York to work on the script with him, something strange would happen.
It really started to make us laugh a lot, and then of course there was that silence when we looked at each other and said, do you think that this could really be a comedy?
The script of Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, became a comedy, and Kubrick's business relationship with James B. Harris ended in the winter of 1961. The film would be financed by Columbia Pictures.
Part of the price of giving Kubrick the money, Columbia demanded that he use Sellers again, who'd been such a success in Lolita, they felt, and he had to also appear in multiple roles. That was the deal.
So Peter loved that idea, and he loved improvising. It was his first real opportunity to develop characters while working, because although he had had the experience in Lolita of doing that, much of Lolita was already scripted.
With Kubrick at the helm and Sellers attached to star, the cast and crew of Dr. Strangelove would spend 6 months creating what would become a cinematic masterpiece.
He knew most of the technical functions. This questioning mind of his wanted to find out what makes me tick. So he was standing behind me, and I'll never forget one day he said, "Now I know how you come up with these ideas, because you take all your lines to one point." And I said, "Stanley, that's known as a vanishing point. It's purely a help, but it doesn't create the design." When I came up with a doodle of a triangular shape, he then asked me, "Isn't a triangle the strongest geometric form?" And without hesitation, I said, "Yes, you're absolutely right." He said, "So how are you going to treat the surfaces?" And I said, "Reinforced concrete." "Oh, so it would be like a gigantic bomb shelter." And so he accepted it.
The battle scene, I mean, Stanley wanted it played as real as possible, you know. In other words, he wanted handheld cameras.
First of all, we wanted it to look different. And we wanted to use orthochromatic stock if we could get it. Well, I found 70,000 feet at the RAF at Stanmore. And we used it. Now, I dressed up with full uniform on, and so did Stanley. We both took Ariflex cameras, and we went in the long grass. We mustn't let ourselves be exposed to machine gun fire or anything. And we did the whole battle sequence like that, handheld.
We shot the whole attack on Berbiston Air Base with a handheld Ariflex himself, because Stanley wanted that sort of documentary look for that scene.
While putting the finishing touches to the film, Kubrick's mind looked toward the heavens for his next ambitious project.
During the release of Strangelove, I would see Stanley socially and to a limited degree. And one day we're having lunch at Trader Vic's, and I asked him what his next project was. And he looked at me and he said, I thought in a rather pitiful way, really. He said, "You'd laugh at me, like a child." It was a very childlike thing for him to say. And he thought for a minute and he said, "It's going to be about ETs." I said to him when he was telling me all the things he was reading, hundreds of books and short stories. And I said, "Why don't you just go to the best and be done with it?" And he said, "Well, who's the best?" And I said, "Arthur C. Clarke."
Clarke had written a science fiction story titled The Sentinel, which Kubrick saw as the basis for a feature film on a grand scale.
One evening, and it was a Sunday night, 11:30 at night. That's when Stanley did much of his living, because he slept all day. When he was not in production, he would sleep till 3 in the afternoon and work all night. And he was very much a night person. And he called at 11:30 one night, and we chatted for a minute, and he said, "When you go in tomorrow, quit." I'd been with Columbia 10 years at that point, and I said, "Why?" He said, "Arthur and I going to England, and we're going to make a movie." He said, prophetically, the working title is 2001: A Space Odyssey. It will never hold.
Kubrick's total proficiency with every part of filmmaking could now be brought to bear on a project from his seat of power, the director's chair.
Stanley knew what everybody should be doing on a set. He knew what each job entailed. Providing you knew your job and Stanley considered you competent, he left you alone. I mean, just to get on with your job.
His ideal film unit is actors, a set, a script that he's written, and nobody else.
Once he respects the people he has around him, and he listens to them, And he's always open to ideas, he's always approachable.
And he'd look at everything and say, oh, great, great, great. What would happen if we changed this or that?
And what he finally got was better than anything that came before. And everything that came before was terrific.
Kubrick became comfortable with spontaneous perfection and adept at exploiting it.
Again and again, Stanley did things like that, partly as a result of calculation, but sometimes as a result of accident. Stanley used to quote James Joyce, who said that accidents are the portals to revelation, the gateways to revelation. And as soon as Stanley realized that there was a happy accident on the set and that he was getting some kind of revelation that wasn't in the screenplay or in the performance a moment ago, he made sure that it was in the finished shot.
Like a fiercely protective parent, Kubrick was totally vigilant as he carefully readied 2001 for release.
When the film first was screened in New York City, Stanley patrolled the theater like a tiger would his hunting block, and he knew who was squirming and where. He made notes, and he called out from the theater and to meet him at the MGM building on Avenue of the Americas. And that night he went from the theater to MGM, and he worked all night. And by dawn, he had 19 minutes out of that film.
Kubrick's iron discipline resulted in a film that left audiences stunned.
Well, 2001 broke the barrier, of course, in terms of visual effects. When you really look at 2001 now, amazingly, it stands the test of time. And the patience and the skill that had to be used and had to be put together by Stanley. I mean, he's a superb filmmaker, and if you look at 2001, a lot of new barriers had to be broken.
2001's commercial triumph cemented Kubrick's reputation. He could now film any subject he wanted.
A Clockwork Orange aroused great controversy because it was shown in Britain at a time when the country was undergoing various political upheavals. There were lots of strikes. There was a coal miners' strike. There was a 3-day week because power was short. Violence had increased on the streets. And in the middle of all this, Stanley Kubrick brings out A Clockwork Orange, that although the violence in it is extremely stylized, nevertheless is filmed and directed and acted in such a way that it unsettled audiences. It got beneath their defenses in self-interest, assisted by police warnings that they couldn't protect him. After the film had been distributed in Britain, he withdrew it from any further exhibitions in Britain so that no one should blame him for any crime in the streets, but also that he shouldn't expose himself or his family to any unnecessary risks.
Kubrick's next film was intended to be a period piece about the life of Napoleon. Instead, he found inspiration in a historical novel by Thackeray.
The financing for Napoleon fell through, and Stanley, who had always wanted to make a big epic, better than Spartacus, couldn't find any alternative sources of finance.
Now, Barry Lyndon, one will always remember because he introduced the idea of the slow zoom in to a scene and the slow zoom out, and he does this all the time throughout the picture.
It's a film that surprised people because they didn't expect a costume film, an historical film, to be treated the way it was. But it's a brilliant reproduction of 18th century society, showing the state of European society from the very lowest to the very highest, right up to the king and the royal court, through the adventures and misadventures of a young man on the make, Barry Lyndon, played by Ryan O'Neal.
Kubrick's signature creativity left its stamp on Thackeray's stage story.
Stanley's scripts, you know, are fairly, in the beginning, fairly non-specific, you know, at times. For example, in Barry Lyndon, they had this long, great dueling scene in the script that says they duel. Now, he knows he's Kubrick, you know. If you wrote a script, if I wrote a script, and we said they do, no, we'd have to describe it in nice language so that some story reader could envision it. But if it's Kubrick, you just write they duel. He needs that. That's all he needs. You know, he'll do it when he's on the set.
The staging of the scenes is so well done, and the interiors are so originally lit. He found this special lens in which he could photograph candles and candlelit photography. They had candles everywhere, you know, and they weren't in ones, they were in 6s and 8s, and it's all there is. And it's very impressive.
It was a very beautiful-looking picture, there's no doubt about it.
For his next project, Kubrick turned once again to veteran camera operator Kelvin Pike.
He gave me a call and sat down and we talked, and he said, I've decided to give up camera operating and take up directing. Will you come back? So, joined him again on The Shining.
Stanley more and more loved to have the confidence to improvise scenes, to put actors through all kinds of different interpretations during the rehearsal period, until that crucial moment arrived where something appeared, either in the performance, or in the way it was directed, or in some element that you added to the performance. That takes time, and that's why Stanley Kubrick is often credited with an insane number of takes in a film. Some actors loved it. Jack Nicholson loved it, because he was of a temperament where he loved it also to improvise his performances, and to some extent to try out new ways, new keys in which he would pitch his performance. It left people gasping for an explanation which they didn't get, because Stanley denied it. It left people to make up their own minds about what was happening on the screen.
Editing the film per se, putting it together, once we had the film together, it was comparatively easy. What was difficult was going through thousands upon thousands of feet of film, finding the right piece of film.
By this time, travel beyond the shores of England was unthinkable for Kubrick. He created a Vietnamese ruin at an abandoned gasworks along the River Thames when he lensed Full Metal Jacket. This time, critics and audiences alike struggled to understand Kubrick's take on another war, Vietnam.
Full Metal Jacket always puzzles people, and that's another reason why the reviews were so unsatisfactory. It wasn't the kind of film they expected at all. They expected a sort of Oliver Stone Platoon kind of film. What they got, in fact, was a 40-minute instructional film on how men are turned into machines by the U.S. Marine Corps.
Full Metal Jacket was Stanley revisiting a war from a totally different perspective. What went into molding soldiers, how they attempted to train them in such a way that they could deal with combat later on.
Kubrick chose Arthur Schnitzler's Trom Novelle as the basis for his next project. It would become more popularly known as Eyes Wide Shut. Kubrick approached the topic of marriage, sexuality, and jealousy from a very different point of view.
Eyes Wide Shut was finally a paean to the sanctity of marriage in the midst of incredible erotic temptation that surrounds us all the time.
Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman being married to each other was a very strong feature that Stanley wanted to bring into the movie.
They were so attached to Stanley. They became progressively more and more attached to him. They were completely devoted to him, and they had fun with him, and they trusted him totally. And Tom was more patient than I've ever imagined anybody could be. And Nicole would, I think, do anything that he asked. They talked, and they watched movies together, and they were in constant collaboration. And as I say, they were devoted to each other.
However, the highly anticipated film was overshadowed by events 4 months prior to its release, when on March 7th, 1999, Stanley Kubrick died in his sleep of a heart attack at the age of 70.
Kubrick died a contented man. Kubrick had achieved everything that he looked for in life, and 10 times over.
More and more, as Stanley Kubrick made his later films, it became a matter of finding out what kind of film he wanted to make. Now that takes time, and as you know, in the film business, time is money. So that's why the films got more and more expensive and took longer to make. Stanley did not use a script like a blueprint in the end. He used it like a restaurant menu. He would pick a little bit here and a little bit there. He would mix and match. He would sometimes send the meal back to the kitchen and start all over again. That's why the films took so long, and that's why there was such a long gap between films.
When you look at what he did make, I mean, that's the extraordinary thing. You look at these films and they are all unique.
Extraordinary man. I never saw him with a script. He never had a script. I mean, he'd use the Continuity Girl script if he wanted to look at anything, but he didn't really look at stage directions at all. It's all in his mind.
He was always looking for that emotion, because that was better than anything. I'm not interested, like he wasn't interested in anything else but that.
He's 8 days older than I am, and you'd think he was my father, you know, the way he was sort of educating me.
He scared the hell out of the executives. The world did not know what to do with Stanley, so as a default thing, we applauded, and it turned out that was the right thing to do. And I hold my memories of Stanley. It was a great privilege. And good night, Stanley.